Hello, and welcome to episode 7 of Through the CSI Lens Behind the Yellow Tape. I'm Christina Brakeman, and yes, I am your host yet again. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate each and every one of you. I am loving your feedback and the connections that we're all making. I truly appreciate it. I hope that you're all finding this somewhat amusing, a little bit entertaining, and also helpful for those of you who are considering moving into forensics or even crime scene investigation as part of a career or education-wise. Of course, you can always reach out to me via email or Instagram messages at Through the CSI Lens, and I will respond, as soon as I can and try to help you to the best of my ability. Just keep in mind that different parts of the country, or if you're in another country, sometimes how that looks as far as pursuing a career or your education in forensics or crime scene investigation may be a little different than what we do here in the Southwest. So I will try to share that information with you as far as how we do it out here or what you may see in the region that you live in. But yeah, I'm always here and available, so please reach out. I would love to hear from you. So last episode 6, I shared a pretty, I think, compelling story of a young child who had been sex trafficked by her mother and, a man that was friends with the mother, and just the neglect and the abuse that she had faced at such a young age, and then talked a little bit about the impact that had on myself, on my colleagues, including the lead detective who actually had to medically retire due to heart issues. I think it was a heart issue, medical condition. It's really none of my business why the person retired, but it was medically, it was a medical retirement, and I heard it was from that case specifically. But it also gave me a chance to share with you how sometimes, very rarely, at least in my experience, how sometimes these cases will go full circle. And again, it's very rare, at least in my experience, but this one was very impactful, and I think definitely for me personally, I needed that closure, and being able, again, to see her thriving, healthy, living in a good foster facility or home with nurturing, loving, protective people was exactly what I needed to remind myself of why I chose to get into this profession. Definitely was never about the money. It was never about notoriety. It was never about having a cool job. It was none of those things. It was, how can I serve my community? And that was the way that I was able to do that. So for that, I'm very grateful for. And even though as hard as that case was, at the end of the day, I'm appreciative that I was the one that was able to respond, and I was the one that was able to help the prosecutors, the detectives, the investigators get validation for that little girl and her family, but also just justice. So that was good. That was a good closure for me. And of course, her little note, and it had her photo attached, was just the icing on the cake. So I think about her often and wonder how she's doing today. So today we're going to talk about, or I guess tonight, I mentioned, and I had posted a couple times, what are some of the common myths that you hear about CSI and how we do our job, what the job looks like, what it entails. Is TV as they display it or show it really, is it an actual or an accurate depiction of the job itself? And I would say probably no. Are there some similarities? Absolutely, right? Because they're basing those TV shows and movies off of the actual job. And what is it that we try to do in the job is to identify someone or exonerate someone. As a CSI, as somebody in forensics, you need to be unbiased, impartial, and you want that because you don't want your preconceived notions or your own opinions things like that to sway you a certain way and affect the quality of the work that you've done. So, although we've handled, many of us, hundreds of crime scenes and we've seen it all before, we always want to go into our crime scenes objectively and looking at it with a clean slate to the best of our ability, right? We're still human. We're still going to carry some of those things with us, those nuances with us. But for the most part, we want to treat that crime scene like it's its own. That's the first one we've gone to, that we're not bringing in, like I said, prejudices or any favoritism or any bias in that crime scene. Because if I was a victim or one of my family members was a victim, I wouldn't want a crime scene person, whether it be a police officer, a detective, anybody coming out to my home or place of business or wherever I was at where a crime occurred and bring, bias in. I'd want somebody who is fair and could do accurate work. So we are going to talk about just a few. I think I have 7 myths, and that's not lost on me because 7 is my lucky number. And so I thought, I stopped at 7 and it just worked out that way. So some of these you've probably heard before, you've probably had conversations before, you've read about it before if you're inquisitive like me. That's one of the things about being a CSI is that I'm very inquisitive. And unfortunately, my new job, because I actually have a new job now, other than teaching at the college, I'm very inquisitive, and they're finding that out because I ask questions like, why are we doing this? And why does it look this way? And why do we have to do it this way? And what is the result of this? But that's because I was a CSI for so long, and you are trained to ask those questions. It's always the who, what, when, where, why, how questions. And so I kind of bring that philosophy into my life in general. So it's kind of funny that my new boss is, she's like, why are you asking me that? Nobody asks me that. But, I like things being explained to me. That helps me do the job better. So let's talk about the first one that I came up with. I didn't get any recommendations, so these are just some of the ones that I know of and I've been asked in the past. So first thing would be myth 1. Every crime scene is thoroughly processed. Yes, that is true. However, it's also not true. And what I mean by that is, in reality, not all crime scenes require, extensive investigation. Many times, depending on staffing, depending on the type of crime scene it is, and depending on the officer and what their skill set and knowledge is, they will handle some of the minor cases without calling one of us dedicated crime scene investigators. If they have their own camera that they've been issued and taken training that was offered through the city, they will take their own photographs. If they have experience finger processing for fingerprints, they will get out their print kit and process for fingerprints. Not every officer and not all the time, but the opportunity is there if they've had the proper training. And so, if you go, let's say your mailbox got broken into, or maybe there's graffiti or some type of criminal damage, or a crime scene that there was no suspect information and nobody was hurt. And to take that even one step further, maybe it's a crime scene where the property damage, if there was any, was, less than $500 or $300. More than likely, the police officer is not going to call a crime scene person because we are busy working major scenes. And I'm not saying that to make you feel like or think that anybody who is a victim in those circumstances I just listed is not important. It's just that we have limited resources, and so we have to utilize them where they're best being used at, right? So you'll find police officers, even detectives, will do some of this work that, you might think a crime scene person needs to come out and do, but it's just not really necessary. Now, there is a caveat to that because there are policies put in place, and every agency has different policies. So as far as police officers, and your agency may require you to have a crime scene personnel come out to that crime scene. It really is going to depend on your policy as well. And they'll have criteria within that policy that says, if you have XYZ, then you shall have crime scene personnel come out. Or you could go one step further. Maybe you're calling your sergeant. If you're a police officer or a detective, you're calling your sergeant and saying, hey, this is what I have out here. Is it okay if I go ahead and process for prints or collect, some smaller pieces of evidence, or, maybe collect some DNA? And your sergeant may give you authorization to do that, especially if you only have 2 crime scene personnel for the whole city, and they're telling you that you're probably going to be waiting anywhere from 1 to 3 hours because we're just that busy. Is it advantageous for you to leave a police officer tied up for 3 hours if they can really just capture a couple images with their photograph or their camera, or process for prints, with some powder that they have? So you have to weigh that as well. So there's a lot of things that go into it, but just because a crime occurred doesn't mean a crime scene unit is going to come out. Matter of fact, one time I got sent out to a vehicle burglary. So in a burglary, that means that somebody broke in or crossed a threshold of personal property, whether it be your house, whether it be your car, whether it be your place of business. And they break in, they force entry, or maybe you leave something unsecured and they come in and they damage property or they steal from you. So I went out to this residential neighborhood and somebody's car had been broken into. So I show up and the victim goes, "Why are you here?" And I said, "I'm here to process your vehicle." They said, "Your vehicle is broken into." And he's like, "Yeah, but why is a crime scene person coming out to process a vehicle burglary?" I'm like, "That's just what we do here." He's like, "Oh man," he goes, "I work for the city of blah, blah, blah." He goes, "We would never send a crime scene investigator out for a vehicle burglary." I'm like, "Well, lucky for you, the city does, and I'm here to be of service." So again, it really just depends on your city, your agency, your policies, your staffing, and the type of crime, value-wise, dollar-wise, damage-wise. So all those things go into consideration. So that was myth 1 that I thought we would bust open real quick. And myth 2, CSIs only work on homicides. Not true. But again, there's a caveat to that. Some agencies will have crime scene investigators who only handle major crimes. And then they'll have crime scene investigators that will handle the more simple crimes, the property crimes, simple accidents. So there are agencies who structure their crime scene unit that way. Obviously, if they're responding to homicides in major cases, they have more experience, for one. That's going to be the biggest thing. They're going to have more experience, maybe more education, more training. All of those things are going to be required before they respond to those more serious, heinous crimes. But for the majority of crime scene units, we don't just go to homicide crime scenes. We handle most every type of crime, at least the agency I worked for. So we are often involved in processing crime scenes for a wide range of cases. So like I mentioned earlier, vehicle burglaries, it could be a residential burglary, so somebody's broken into your home. Could be a commercial burglary, so somebody's broken into your business. Could be a car accident, whether it be a fatal car accident where somebody died. Could be a hit and run accident, or it could be an officer involved accident. Could even be a DUI or suspected DUI accident. All those things would be types of crimes that we would respond to. Also assaults, whether it be somebody was battered or beaten up, like was in a physical confrontation, a physical fight where they were injured, or maybe there was a weapon used in the assault, so a knife, anything could be a weapon. Anything can be a weapon. Your keys to your car could be a weapon. So any type of an assault, a robbery, whether it is with a weapon or not. So a robbery is something you're taking or you're doing, and you're taking something with force. So it could be a bank robbery. It could be, you're walking down the street and somebody steals your cell phone or your purse or something similar to that. So even criminal damage, somebody's doing gang graffiti, maybe somebody broke into a mailbox, or somebody put a Molotov cocktail in a mailbox, or a string of cluster mailboxes were broken into. All those things could be crime scenes that we respond to. And again, that's going to depend on your agency and the city you work for. they are going to set that precedent as far as what kind of crimes you're going to be responding to. So again, for me personally, we went to every crime scene you can think of. Suicides, death scenes where a doctor wasn't willing to sign off on the death certificate, child abuse, sexual assault, any of those things. We literally went to every single one of those cases. So not just homicides like what you see on TV. We do it all. And so that's why, and it really makes you a well-rounded crime scene investigator because you get so much exposure and so much experience working different types of scenes. I mean, I'm not complaining. It keeps you busy and it's never a dull moment. Myth number 3, a single CSI handles all evidence. Not true. At least, again, not for me. So this again is going to be determined by the agency you work for, by the police department you work for, and the crime scene unit you work for, or the crime lab you work for. They are going to determine whether or not it will just be you responding to a crime scene or if you're going to go out with a team. I would say 98% of the time I responded to the crime scene by myself. I worked the crime scene by myself. So that means I'm doing the photography by myself. I'm doing any advanced photography by myself. I am searching the scene by myself. I am taking field notes, writing my observations by myself. I sometimes am doing sketching, although my agency, most of the time, if it required a sketch, the detective would do that because it would be a major crime scene. We wouldn't do sketches on vehicle burglaries or residential burglaries, but major crimes, we would. And typically, a detective's on scene with you, so they're going to take responsibility for that, which is nice because it's very tedious. Processing for fingerprints, processing for DNA, collecting DNA, using chemical reagents to enhance blood evidence, all of those things, collection of the items, preservation of the items. I'm doing that all by myself. I do know that there are other crime scene units where they go out in teams, and you have somebody who just does photography. You have somebody who only does fingerprint processing and DNA processing and collection. You have somebody responsible for videography or doing the drone photography, or you have somebody doing sketching. So you're working as a team. I didn't have that experience, but it is possible that depending on what agency you work with, or work for it, they will have multiple people respond. I will say about the only time that it didn't work that way for me is maybe if we had an officer involved shooting or a homicide. And then you might have another CSI come out and help you maybe do, if you needed to do extra chemical processing on blood evidence or shoe prints or tire prints. You might have somebody come out and help you with that while you're doing something else. Or if you're working an officer-involved shooting, usually you have one CSI working the actual shooting scene, and then you have another CSI that's actually working with the officer and the members from the range. And in that situation, that CSI is photographing the officer in uniform so we can show what he or she looked like. We are photographing all of their equipment, including their guns, their magazines, their ammunition. Excuse me, all of that's being disassembled in the range. There's somebody from the range that is there that is going to take possession of all of the officers' guns. So you have to photograph that methodically. So usually you'll have 2 crime scene people, at least for my agency, doing that. Sometimes you won't have enough people, so you'll have to do that, break from the scene and go take care of the police officer and all that. So, but most of the time, you're working your crime scenes by yourself. And yes, you can be out there for hours and hours and hours. The only case I really know of that I've heard of recently maybe is like the Jodi Arias case. That case, I guess, that scene was closed down for up to 3 days, which is unusual. And they had multiple disciplines out there at the scene, working that scene. And so, like, you had somebody from serology helping with blood spatter evidence, and you had the latent print examiners out there, and you had the whole caveat of people out there, group of people out there working that scene. So, but yeah, most of the time I'm out there by myself. shagging that call, putting in the hours. And, you could be out there for an hour and a half, bare minimum, or you could be out there the entire shift. And then if you have a scene where it's kind of a fluid situation and during the course of the investigation, detectives are finding additional scenes related to it that you need to go to, you could end up with another 2, 3, 4 search warrant scenes that you have to go to. So it wouldn't be uncommon that you'd work all 5 scenes by yourself, and that will take up your 10 hours of your shift plus more. So again, that's just based off my experience. It makes for a very long day. But yeah, so we can work as a team, but typically we don't work as a team. Do we work with detectives? Yes. So technically they are part of our team. Do we work with patrol officers? Yes. So technically they are part of our scene. But when it comes to the forensic side of it, we are responsible for that. So, but as far as having other CSIs on scene, that's very rare. It doesn't happen too often, at least not in my experience. Myth 4. Forensic evidence is processed quickly. No. That does not work that way. So for me, obviously, if I'm at a crime scene, there's some evidence processing that I'm doing, right? Especially if it's a property crime, I'm not collecting too much. Unless somebody left something behind, like a suspect or investigative lead left something behind, I'll collect that. If it's a weapon or something that was used as a weapon or anything evidentiary that I think that the crime lab could process and get better results, then I would collect that. Otherwise, I'm just going to be processing for fingerprints out there or collecting for DNA swabs, things like that, doing photography, and leaving it there. And then I submit what I collect to our evidence section, which then gets assigned a forensic scientist, which then they do the analysis. So it's kind of a chain reaction. But contrary to what is shown like on TV, like CSI or any of those shows, what do they show you? They show them all huddled around at this, lit up table, and they're, bringing up evidentiary data, and they're solving the crime right there. They're telling you who the fingerprints belong to right then. They're telling you who the DNA belongs to. They're telling you who the vehicle tire belongs to. They're doing all those things. That's not how that works. I know most of you know that. That's just for entertainment purposes. But oftentimes it takes a long time to analyze evidence, and that is due to backlogs, right? We have backlogs in the lab, and there are things that take more precedence. It also depends on the priority of the case. If it's a high-profile case, you might get pushed to the front of the line through conversation, so that would require the detective and the forensic administrator. So forensic administrator is in charge of the lab. They're like the top supervisor, and they run the entire lab. They supervise the entire lab. So that would be a conversation you're having with your detectives, with your detective sergeants and lieutenants, and the forensic administrator. They are going to be having those conversations if something needs to be a priority and needs to be done right away. That's not something that the crime scene investigator is part of. And also another thing that affects, when evidence is processed is the sample quality. If they determine in the preliminary steps of analysis that the sample quality, there's an integrity issue with the sample, maybe there's not enough quantity of the sample to complete testing, or perhaps even it's been contaminated, then that's also going to delay any form of analysis. So one of the reasons why the agency I worked for ended up getting their own crime lab is because there was such a huge turnaround time from the state lab. And that's no fault of the state lab. Remember, they are servicing all of the police departments or crime units in that whole state that doesn't have either their own crime lab or they're not contracted to have their evidence analyzed by a different crime lab. So they are dealing with the whole state. So it could be months, 3 months, 6 months, 8 months before evidence is analyzed, especially like DNA evidence. And if you're an agency that has a serial rapist, or you suspect a serial rapist, the last thing you want to be waiting is 8 months to get DNA results back. So that's when it's really beneficial to have your own accredited crime lab. But not all agencies or all cities can afford that. Again, that's a tax-funded crime lab. So when people pay increased bonds or pay their property taxes, it's going for resources like your crime lab. So that would be myth 4. As far as fingerprints, for me personally, once I've gone to my crime scene and I've collected fingerprints, I've submitted them to the evidence section. It's been assigned a latent print examiner or a forensic scientist. They're the same. It could be, I don't know, anywhere from a week to 2 weeks, maybe a little longer for you to get results back on those fingerprints. Did I personally stop and look at all of my cases to see what fingerprints came back to who? No, because honestly, I'm moving on. I am busy. I am going call to call, and that's just history for me. I did get notified if it came back to somebody, if it was identified to somebody, whether it be DNA or fingerprints. They did send us notification like, hey, your fingerprints from this crime scene came back to so-and-so. Or, hey, your DNA that you collected from this crime scene came back to so-and-so. So I would get email notifications for that, but I wouldn't go seeking them out. And other agencies could do that a little bit differently too, but that's just how the agency did it at my lab. Next myth 5, are fingerprints and DNA are always reliable. Nope. And I get it that we, as a society, on TV, in entertainment, we put this huge value in fingerprint and DNA. And I will give you that they are probably the most valuable evidence when it's suitable, when it's probative, when it's quality evidence. But there's no guarantee that it will be at your crime scene. There's so many factors that go into whether or not that fingerprint is suitable to be analyzed. Whether or not that DNA has enough information that it can be identified. So fingerprints and DNA can be very misleading, right? So fingerprints may not always be unique, and DNA only indicates presence at a crime scene, just like fingerprints, but does not tell you that the person is guilty of the crime. So imagine if you were going to the Circle K gas station, how many people come in and out of that door? And how often do you see them cleaning that door? So the chances that your fingerprint could be lifted off that door on any given day that you were there is relatively high. Does that mean that you were the one that went into the store and robbed them and stole their money or stole lottery tickets or stole merchandise? No, just means you were there. So we can't automatically assume just because somebody's fingerprints and DNA are at a scene that they're guilty or that they committed the crime. Obviously, there has to be the totality of the evidence. What other evidence points to that person or excludes all others? So just because you have fingerprints and DNA, again, doesn't mean that you are going to necessarily find out that who committed the crime or that it's going to be valuable enough to be able to analyze and be able to identify someone. So a lot of times when you're processing for fingerprints, you're not getting a full hand. You're not getting a full finger. If you look at your hand, you're going to see these tiny little lines. Those are called ridge details. And so everybody has them, and they are classified based on the pattern, based on the ridges that you see. Those lines that you see, those all form patterns. And so those give us characteristics to look for in that fingerprint that we lift at the crime scene. But if you don't get enough of that detail, you might not be able to make an ID. You might not ever be able to find out who that fingerprint belongs to because there's only a partial detail. So just because somebody touches the surface doesn't mean they're going to leave a full handprint or a full fingerprint. And again, you have to think about what happened to the crime scene after the incident occurred. Was there bad weather? Did it rain? Did it snow? Was it dusty? Was it, were you living in the desert and you had monsoon season, or you live up north and it rains and it snows all the time? Or how many people come in and out of that door? what's been sat down on that surface. If it was a countertop, how many people have put their coat down, their purse down, their cell phone down, a box down. So all these things can disturb physical evidence left at a crime scene. So all these things have to be taken into consideration when determining whether or not something is suitable, whether or not something can be analyzed, whether or not something has enough value. So all those things go into play when you're talking about physical evidence, specifically fingerprints and DNA. So myth 6, crime scenes look glamorous and clean, and investigators work in well-lit, tidy labs, and they always wear fitted, clean, pressed uniforms or suits. TV again shows your CSI investigators wearing a suit, they're wearing high heels, their blouses open up down to their chests, and they're wearing jewelry, and their hair's down, and it's flowing, and, it's beautiful, and their makeup is perfect. Yeah, that's not happening. If you're in a crime lab and you're a forensic scientist, probably you're going to look more presentable, right? Because you're in a controlled environment, you're working in an office type setting, a lab type setting, so you're probably going to look a little bit more put together than a CSI who's out in the field, who's climbing water towers, who's climbing in dumpsters, who's climbing underneath, travel trailers and mobile homes, who, working in decomp bodies and crime scenes. I'll tell you what, I didn't wear makeup to work. If I did, it was very rare. Most of the time, my hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and I was wearing a baseball hat because it's hot, it's messy, it's gross. Last thing I care about is if I'm wearing makeup. The other thing is the uniform. Your uniform's getting dirty. You could get stains. You could get bleach stains. You could get blood stains on them. Bodily fluid, insect activities from insects landing on you. You could, they could fade, wear and tear. I mean, most of the time we were wearing cargo pants and a polo shirt. So we're looking presentable, right? Because we want to be professional, but the job doesn't really allow us to look polished because of the type of work we do. Now, if you're lucky enough to go a whole shift without any crazy crime scenes that are requiring you to, crawl around on your hands and knees or, dive in dumpsters, you might look pretty good. But most of the time, you're looking like a hot mess by the time you get done with your shift. Not to mention the weather, because you're working out in inclement weather. When it's in Arizona, you're in Arizona and you're working it's 115 degrees out. I'm telling you what, you look horrible. And you add to that the different chemicals you're working with, like especially the black powders that we use to process for fingerprints. That stuff gets everywhere. It flies through the air. It gets all over your skin. It gets in your hair. It gets on your clothes. It penetrates through your clothes. It gets in your nose. It gets into your eyes. It gets into your fingertips. It gets everywhere all the time. So you go home at the end of the day and you literally look like you worked at a coal mine factory because you have so much black powder everywhere. So yeah, we're not looking all glamorous and tidy and clean, maybe at the beginning of the shift, but not so much throughout the shift. Forensic scientists, they have a little bit more of a luxury, I would say, because they're not working out in the elements and they're not exposed to that. So yeah, we're not looking like $1 million. And also with that being said, we're not driving Humvees. We're driving CSI vehicles. Usually they are the Ford Transport vans or a Chevy van or a Ford van, fully extended van. We're not driving. They're nice vehicles. They're well-equipped vehicles, but they're not luxury vehicles by any means. So we are not pulling up to our crime scenes in a Humvee, just so you know. Myth 7. Every case goes to trial quickly. I think this is probably one of the biggest misconceptions. Matter of fact, I just testified over the summer on a case from 2013. It's 2025, people. So good luck trying to remember everything you did. That's why you take good notes and that's why you write reports. And sometimes just because you went to a crime scene and you did work doesn't mean you're even going to testify. You're going to be called to court. A lot of times they'll plead. They'll plead to lower charges or make some type of an arrangement or just plead guilty. And you'll never even testify. At least for me personally, that's my personal experience. I would say in a year's time, I testified under 5 times a year. If I reached 5 testimonies in a year, that would be very unusual. But I think some of that also has to do with the kind of crime lab I worked for. We were in an accredited lab, so we had very strict policies and procedures. Prosecutor's office knows that. When they see our agency name, they know that we are squared away. There's not going to be, I shouldn't say there's not, the likelihood that there would be a problem with the evidence that we collected and processed and analyzed would be highly improbable. Not totally improbable, but just highly improbable. And it's also that way with the defense side. They know us, they know our reputation, they know the quality of our work, they know we're squared away, so they're really not going to have too many challenges that they're going to be able to bring up. So, and usually if they're bringing up challenges, they're doing that before we even go to court. So again, you could wait years to go to court for trial, or you may never even go. It really just depends. So the myth is that crimes are solved and prosecuted within a single day, a single year, a single month. Not happening. It's just not going to go that way. Even with the city court, municipal court, it takes a while to even get to court. Good 3 to 6 months. And a lot of times there's so many extensions that are filed. I mean, it just keeps getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. So again, it could take several months or years before you even testify. Same thing in federal court. If you have to testify in federal court, it could be decades before you go to court because you're talking about federal offenses. So really important, whether you're a forensic scientist or a crime scene investigator or a police officer or a detective, that you're taking copious, thorough notes at your crime scenes and, really documenting them well, because good luck trying to remember what you did 10 years prior. So again, reality is most real investigations take months or years and many remain unsolved. I still have a case that I handled where I had a transient person who was living out of a vehicle. I really thought we were going to get some DNA and some fingerprints off of the physical evidence that I collected, and I was shocked when we, at the time, now it could have changed since 2022 when I retired, but I haven't been called to court, so I haven't had to testify yet, but I was really shocked that there was DNA present, male DNA present, but there was no profile in the database. I was really shocked. Same thing for fingerprints, that they were not able to get any suitable fingerprints. I was really disappointed. And that was just a good reminder that, hey, you can't put all of the weight into DNA or fingerprints. You really need to look at the entire crime scene and look for everything that could be related to that crime. Whether it be trace evidence like hairs and fibers, whether it be finger or shoe prints, shoe prints or tire tracks, what pry marks, any of that stuff. So you really have to look at the big picture and can't get tunnel vision as far as focusing, we have this weapon that we collected at the crime scene and they're for sure going to get fingerprints off that weapon, or hey, we have this object that we collected, this physical item that we collected from this crime scene, there's got to be fingerprints on there. Or hey, I collected hairs or what look like hairs or fibers from the person's body that doesn't look like they belong to the victim. That's got to have something of value, You just never know. So you just definitely have to process those crime scenes as thorough as possible so that if you run across the circumstance or the situation where the DNA is not on file or the fingerprints are not on file, you have something else to go to solve that crime. And as far as I know, that crime scene has not been solved, but I could be wrong. I just have not been called to testify to court. So those are some of the myths that I came up with that I thought a lot of people are always asking, when they watch those true crime, or not even true crime, but those entertainment crime shows. Now, when you start getting into Forensic Files or Crime Scene 360 or The Next 48, that's real life stuff. They're going to actually show you real life circumstances, real life processes. The only thing I will say about that is a lot of times those shows are not recent. So sometimes the techniques or the processes that you see being used in that episode have advanced, or there's new equipment or new process. So that's the only caveat to that, to those type of calls or those type of shows, is that there could be an advancement in technology or processes. So, but other than that, most of those are pretty accurate. And you'll see sometimes if they're specifically geared towards crime scene itself, not necessarily the investigation part from the detectives, but if it's just crime scene in general, you'll see different parts of the country or even different parts of the world, they handle crime scenes a little bit different as far as how they process their crime scenes. So you'll see a little bit of fluctuation in that as well, but not too much. For the most part, we're all doing similar tasks, but they may differ in just a little bit. So hopefully you enjoyed this whole Mythbuster episode. I thought that was fun. But yeah, we definitely do not testify in court that often. We definitely don't go to court right away. We definitely don't get IDs right away as far as, fingerprints, DNA. The databases today make it much more accessible and quicker than a decade ago or 2 decades ago. So for fingerprints, we're using IAFIS. It's a database. It's a national database. So if you've ever been fingerprinted for work, the military, you've ever been arrested, your fingerprint's going to be in that DNA or in that fingerprint database. And that database is maintained by the FBI. So if I go to a crime scene and I collect fingerprints, that fingerprint card, as long as the latent print examiner determines that the quality is there in the print, which means there's enough detail of the fingerprint in there that I lifted that they can put it through the database. It can be scanned and seen if there's any matches in the database. One thing I want to tell you about these databases is that they make mistakes. They are not 100% accurate. You still need somebody to verify the results. So even though a latent print examiner may get an ID from the IAFIS database, that's IAFIS database, they still have to verify that that is the print and it matches. And then once that latent print examiner goes through their series of verification or analysis, then a second latent print examiner has to confirm their results. If they don't get the same results, then they have to go back and see where the error occurred, whether it be through a process, a step that they did, or something with the database. So, and DNA is the same way. It's called CODIS. It's the Combined Index, Database Index. And so if you've ever been to prison, certain jobs, you have to give your DNA sample, like I had to give my DNA sample. Those are housed in a national database only for law enforcement and maintained by the FBI. And so if I go to a crime scene and I see an open Coke can and I say, that looks new, and I ask the victim, hey, is that your Coke can? And he or she says no, then common sense would tell me that somebody drank from that can. It probably is the suspect. So I'm going to take what looks like a cotton swab. I'm going to dampen it with distilled water, and then I'm going to take that cotton swab and gently rub the surface of the can. So the mouth opening of the can, right? Because you would think that they would put their mouth and their lips on the opening, right? That's what we do. And so I'm going to swab that area, hoping to collect some DNA profile. And then I'm going to submit that to my evidence section. And then it's going to be assigned to forensic scientists in serology. And then they are going to start the analysis, that process, trying to determine who that DNA comes back to. Same thing if I saw blood at the crime scene. I would do the same thing. Or if I saw another bodily fluid, whether it be spit or maybe vaginal fluids or seminal fluids, I would do the same process with a cotton swab with distilled water, and I would collect samples, or what I think is a sample. So there's a little bit more that goes into it. We can talk about that in a later time, but that kind of gives you an idea of what that process looks like for the crime scene personnel. So yeah, there we go. The top 7 myths that I came up with. So thanks again for tuning in. My next episode, I believe I will be talking about a case that involved animals. Hoarding of animals. So if you have a sensitivity towards animals, just let that be a trigger warning to you, because it really affected me and I was quite shocked about it. So we're going to be talking about an animal case I worked with. Normally, if I did do an animal case, it was because one of our canine dogs bit a suspect, or somebody killed, like during a domestic dispute, they killed their dog to get back at their partner. I did have a few of those that were killed by the other partner. But this one was a totally different situation. So we'll talk about that on the next episode. And again, if you are an animal lover, it might trigger you. So I will just forewarn you now, and I'll try to remind you at the beginning of that episode. But we'll talk a little bit about that crime scene. But I just wanted to say thanks for stepping behind the yellow tape with me today. If you enjoyed this episode of Through the CSI Lens, the best way that you can support me, which I truly appreciate, supporting this show is by leaving a quick rating or writing a review at one of the podcast downloads formats, whichever one you choose, whether it be Apple, Spotify, iHeart, all of the different ones. It also helps people who love true crime and forensic science discover us, and it also keeps me bringing you more cases straight from the crime scene. Make sure to hit follow so you don't miss the next episode. Until then, stay curious, and I'll see you behind the tape.